Okay, it's recording.
Okay. So, hello everyone to our Metadata Challenge webinar series. We are at webinar number 8, and this webinar is titled Scientific Data and Semantic Representation of Scientific Data, and we are joined with Professor Stuart J. So the brief agenda for the meeting will be, I'm going to 5 minutes of the introduction talk to the topic, then followed by the keynote presentation by Professor Stuart J on the SciData semantic representation data model. After that, we will have around 10 minutes for questions and answers, and closing up by some comments by Sarah Barber. So the reason why we have this webinar series and the main goal of them was trying to answer this question: how do we realize the value of our data? And this is especially important for wind energy sector, as well as we've seen that the successful digitalization of wind energy sector, it's a key driver for reducing costs and risks over the whole wind energy project life cycles. And here the opportunities are many, and there are drones, digital twins, including the ones that are capable of predictive maintenance, decision support systems, and in general, AI systems. All of these systems can contribute to reducing the maintenance costs and increase the amount of energy that is delivered by the systems. But to realize this artificial intelligence systems with such capabilities, it's not enough just to have good understanding of physics, good simulations, good data analytics. We need just to be able to have the technical capabilities. We need to process, interpret, and perform logical operations on all of the data, which is usually known as a knowledge engineering domain. And to do this, the data has to be structured and represented in a certain format capable to be used by these systems, which is known as a knowledge representation. So today's topic is very much in this domain of knowledge representation, of how do we take scientific data and how do we represent it so it's machine understandable, machine interpretable. In general, this question of how do we realize the value of data was picked up by International Energy Agency, and they organized the IEA Wind Task 43 because they realized the importance of digitalization in wind energy. It's a part of IEA Wind Technology Collaboration Program. You can find more information about on the website. And just recently, this Task 43 got an extension, of which Sarah Barber is a cooperative agent. And one of the subtasks in the extension is actually learning a lot about metadata and about the problems of knowledge engineering and knowledge representation. This webinar series, they fall into this metadata learning task. So in general, onto today's topic, we're going to be talking about scientific data and standard data models. So many of you might be familiar with the concepts of fair data, where fair is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. And in this particular context, we are interested in interoperability and reusability aspects of it. So in our case, interoperability, it assures that data is easily shared and understood across different systems, applications, and organizations. So the common data language is used. It is possible to use it in integrated systems, and it provides possibilities for collaboration. And then the reusability aspect of it ensures that the standard models, they help with data representation that is easier, efficient, to conduct data analysis, draw insights, and have more accurate predictions. So it ensures data longevity, it optimizes the resources so that we don't regather data every time we need something new. Organizations can share it between data between themselves, so they don't have to waste resources on each one doing their own thing. And obviously it fosters innovation. So very, very briefly, the topics we're going to be talking today are quite complex. They involve things from semantic technologies, web stack, which is quite an elaborate topic, and in particular linked data, which is like a slice of these of all of these topics. As it says in the picture, it's not a piece of cake. It might be difficult. So if for people who are not very familiar with these terms, it might be useful to look into them before listening to this presentation. But very briefly on the vocabulary or the things we're going to be using in this is one is the JSON, which is a JavaScript Object Notation. It's just a serialization format. It's a way to store data with certain syntax. In particular for JSON, it's a key value pairs. We can think of it just like a CSV, just a way to store data. Another concept is RDF, which is a resource description framework. It's just a specification to represent graph type data on the web. So when we have a source node, an edge of certain type, and a target node in a graph, we can think of it as a triplet. So in example here I provide, there is Aventa v7, which is a source node. Type is a relationship or an edge of a graph, and wind turbine is a target node. JSON-LD is JSON for linked data. It's just a way to serialize our RDF triplets. And then we're gonna hear us talk a lot about semantics, which basically means meaning of statements made in a certain language. It can be a formal language like OWL or any other language that we use to describe our data. So done with the basic introduction, I'm gonna hand it over to Professor Stuart J, who is a professor of analytical chemistry at North Florida, University of North Florida. He's his background is in analytical chemistry, but currently his group is focused on knowledge representation and semantic models for data in a chemical domain. So over to you, Professor.
Okay, thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can you see my slides okay?
Yep.
Okay, good. And should be full screen now. Okay.
It is indeed.
What's that?
I was just saying it is in full screen.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I misheard.
It sounded like you said isn't. Didn't.
I was like, because you know what happens when the screen gets, anyway. Thanks very much for the introduction. This is very interesting that I got the opportunity to speak to this particular group because, one, it is very outside of my domain, but it turns out that it's now something I'm quite interested in, and I will explain what I mean by that in a little bit. So I'm an analytical chemist by training, but what I ended up finding was that I love analytical chemistry, but I was actually very much more interested in the data that was being generated, and more importantly, I was interested in understanding how to organize that data in a way that meant the context was with it. Because one of the things in analytical chemistry that's very important is, you're basically trying to represent the concentration of some chemical substance in some type of sample using a particular analytical technique. So that's quite a complicated context, and to be able to represent that is difficult in a succinct way. So I moved into to data. I'm kind of basically on my own, and then worked out how to move forward into the area of semantics. And this presentation is the consequence of that, which is that in the United States, I was awarded a National Science Foundation grant to work on taking heterogeneous data in different formats of different types and migrate them into the SciData format for the idea of then being able to search across those different data sets. And so this presentation comes out of the research we've been doing on that particular grant. So I'm going to go through the first three bullets, basically. I have some extra material in the slides to kind of talk about some of the more practical stuff of, one, how we deal with all the data that we convert into SciData, and then some other applications of SciData. Knowledger on this list is a prototype project that we did with the US National Institute of Standards and Technology to see if we could use SciData in its format as the basis for a digital research notebook. And I'll talk a little bit about that if I have time. And then also, we are also representing chemical molecules in SciData as chemical twins. And that's kind of a pertinent corollary to the comment about twins in the wind energy sense. So here's a thing, basically a presentation of a paper in analytical chemistry, again, which is my area. But this is generally what we will see in any research area, that you have a paper. These days, what we know is that papers are maybe not the best way to publish research, simply because they are a very small format. You have to kind of align what you and how much you say with what the publisher allows you to do. And as far as data is concerned, of course, in most cases, people will try and present the best data that they have gathered in their research, because this is the vehicle by which they highlight their research. Okay, we need to move on from that, obviously, and that's where FAIR and a lot of the activities around semantic technologies and just opening up publishing and actually publishing data is where we need to go. So reflecting, though, on the papers that we do publish, there's basically three areas of information that are really important from a paper perspective. They are the description of what was studied within the research, which may be a short paragraph or two, as is shown on the left-hand side of this slide, or it might be quite a long description because it might be a very complicated system. There's hopefully a decent amount of information about how the research was done, so the methodology of how the work was accomplished. And then, of course, there's the data. And this kind of general representation of the areas of metadata on the left-hand side here and the actual experimental data on the right-hand side led me to write a paper that I published in 2016 on SciData as a way to kind of conceptualize how we should be structuring information in scientific research. A lot of that came from my ideas about if we're going to be able to add all of this really important contextual information, one of the things we knew then, and we still know now, is that scientists in a general sense want to do the science. They don't necessarily want to be tasked with capturing the metadata. We know the metadata is very important, but it's sort of a boring part of the process, you could say, for many, many scientists. And so that's why, I think a lot of where we're going is systems, intelligent systems that will allow us to do our research more efficiently and then capture the data, basically born digital, by augmenting what the what the scientist actually is able to put into some kind of interface with as much automated metadata as can be achieved in the background, so that we take away the burden of metadata, which is very important for the context and obviously for potentially publishing the data to the research community, and we allow them to basically do their science by automating the process as much as we can. So we would like, in a utopian situation, to have unambiguous identification of kind of all the things that are part of the research process. So I've mentioned species and samples and instruments, but of course that could be wind turbines, it could be, I don't know, food items, whatever it is that's being studied. We need to have metadata about those things, and maybe eventually we'll get to the point where we have unique identifiers for all those things too. And that's actually something that is being worked on in something called the Research Data Alliance community, where they're talking about persistent identifiers for things in a general sense. If we're going to be able to represent data in a way where we have the experimental data and we have the context with it, we've got to collect as much as we can about how the research data was analyzed, how it was annotated, and who did the work, and do it in a way that can be trusted. Now, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but trust is one of those things where, when you're sharing data, people are like, do I really trust who I'm getting this data from? That's something we need to deal with, because if we're truly going to be in a position where we start really reusing other people's data, obviously we have to have some mechanism by which we can hopefully ensure trust, but at least imply trust would be maybe as good as we can do. So the SciData framework is very conceptual in its foundation. It's just the idea that to be able to contextualize research data in a general sense, you need the methodology information, how the research was done, you need what you were studying, and you need the data that you collected. But in addition to that, in terms of being able to then find that data in whatever format it's in, you need to have some metadata that is what would be considered in a library sense a finding aid. So what are the important attributes of that data that the community would probably be wanting to find your data using? And that's still a work in progress, because one of the things that we're now realizing is that when somebody generates research data, they do it from their own context, and they are not necessarily thinking about the reuse perspective. However, if we really are going to get to the point where researchers in a particular domain are going to think ahead to actually publishing this to the community, then they kind of have to think more broadly, well, how would somebody want to search for this? And so you have to start thinking about what the other metadata elements might be in a finding aid. While this can be implemented in Excel or a relational database in XML, the format I'm going to show today, as was discussed, is this JSON-LD format. And the reason that is the format that I've chosen really to focus on is because, one, it is a text file format because it's a JSON file, but two, it can be converted into RDF or automatically using open source software. And it allows you to semantically annotate the data, which basically means you can give meaning to each of the data elements. And that's a really, really important thing, because there are, as the corpus of data grows, we're going to have a lot of data, we hope, out there and available, and being able to search that is going to rely on really very, very specific terminology and meaning of concepts from different disciplines. And so we have to have a way to do this. So one of the things that I did when I started looking at the JSON-LD implementation was I said, okay, now how are we going to do this the right way? We have a relational database where it has a very defined data model. So it's actually very difficult to take heterogeneous data. And by heterogeneous, I mean in not only in its research type of data, but also in the way it's actually stored, and put it in a relational database, because you kind of have to build the schema in alignment with how the data is actually organized. But the opposite end of that spectrum is the graph database is sort of completely no schema. There's nothing that structures it. It is the nodes, the edges, and then those things being linked together. So as a consequence, there's no kind of framework on which you can actually search across that because everything is kind of represented in a different way. So the SciData format is actually represented in the graph using an ontology. And what that means is it then actually gives you a mechanism to be able to search through the graph using a SPARQL query and find data from different sets using a framework that is the ontology. So that's the basic setup for this. So as was commented, this is all about RDF, which are triples, subject, predicate, object, statements of explicit statements of fact. And in the definition of JSON-LD as an encoding specification, there's also the idea that these triples can be set to be part of a particular graph, sort of a subgraph, if you will. And so, as I'll show you some examples, the @graph name of a data element in JSON-LD allows you to assign all of the triples that are present inside that graph to be of the triple in RDF. So here's the basic layout of a file that would be in the SciData specification. The red box, as you can see on the right-hand side, is where the metadata for the finding aid is stored, so outside of this section called SciData. And I would comment that none of this is necessarily required in the specification. This is kind of where we have standardized on in terms of our finding aid metadata elements, but none is required. And you could add your own, but the consequence of that is you would also have to semantically define that, and I'll talk about that in a second. So the finding aid information allows you to basically have a mechanism to find the data that's in this particular file. The other elements that we have in the SciData section here, I'm going to expand on in a second here. We have the methodology section, we have the system section, and we have the data set section. And we have some other metadata elements just trying to generally characterize what the type of data is in this section, in this file. And then we have mechanisms to be able to add 1 to n sources of where the data came from, and then also a rights statement as to what is the license on this data for reuse. And so in the methodology and system sections, which are where a lot of different types of data can be stored, the ontology does not define what goes in the fields of aspects and facets. It just defines them. So the structure of this that's shown on here is defined in the sense that methodology is defined, type, property, kind are defined, system is defined, data set is defined, and there are some pre-described pieces underneath data set to be able to organize data points, data series, and data groups. But again, aspects and facets are defined in the ontology, but whatever goes inside those sections is not defined by the SciData ontology. That is going to be specific to whatever the data type is that you're putting in. And so as a consequence, it has to be completely open, and it is completely open. When somebody is using SciData, what they do is they decide, well, what pieces of information do we need to put in to describe the system under study and the methodology of how we did the research? And then they have to identify how to organize that information with what name value pairs. And once they've done that, then they also have to write what's called a context file. And the context file is what gives the semantic representation of the individual names of the name value pairs to give the meaning to the information. So for me, and I'm going to show you an example, so hold on. It takes a little bit of getting your head around, I do understand, but the basic premise is the structure is is based off of the SciData ontology in terms of then dictating what the triples will look like in the graph. The organization of the information is done by putting data about the methodology in aspects, data about the system in facets, and the actual experimental data in any one of these three sections as is appropriate for the data that you have available. What's going on? I need to advance. There we go. Here's some other kind of like inside look at what something in the dataset section might look like. And again, these are not required. They're available for use. They're not required. One of the things in the grant that we're working on is to try and see if any more fields should be put into the ontology for expanding the generic usage of this to other data types. One of the things I do want to comment here is that you'll see quantity kind of like twice in here. One has no pound symbol and the other one does have a pound symbol here. One of the things that is possible within the context of a JSON-LD file is not only can you represent something that's textual or numeric as text or a number, but if there is a semantic representation of it somewhere, meaning in an ontology somewhere, then you can actually add that in to the name value pair. And so what we do is, if you want to put a text string in here, you can, and you just call the field quantity. But if you want to put an external reference to the semantic definition of what this quantity is, you use the quantity pound field. And that basically means you can then link out to in another graph where that information is. So the addition of the pound symbol on the end of these names is actually deliberate and across the specification so that we can implement that feature no matter what. So, okay, I'm going to try and give you a very quick demonstration of this for some wind data. So I know it's very small at the bottom of this slide, but I've got some wind data that's been taken from the NREL Wind Toolkit. This will become, you'll see why in a moment that this makes sense. And it is, I know it's very small, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the first row of data, that's row 3 in this image, and I'm going to represent it in SciData so that you get a sense of how this works. Now, in this context, of course, there's no methodology information in this file. There's just data and maybe some information about where it was either acquired or, I think in this case, calculated. So here's what maybe again, a general file of this wind data in SciData. What you'll notice is I've given it a title, and of course that could be whatever is appropriate. I've come up with some kind of UID, and in this case, I've tried to encode the ID of the location, the lat long, and then date timestamp. Of course, that could be anything as appropriate for whatever the data is. I've added in definitions of disciplines. These are what I could find in this. It's an ontology of different scientific disciplines, and whether those are appropriate or not is a good question, but I didn't find one specific to wind data. And so how would we put the data in the file? Well, first of all, in the system section, in addition to the thing under study, we also put things like location and conditions under which the data was collected. And so what you see here is the representation of the location, and this NOAA alias here actually aligns with the NOAA alias right here, which is a fake ontology that NOAA has. The idea being this is how you reference to an ontological definition of the concept. Then we have definition of quantities, so temperature, pressure, and height. And then we use those to represent the actual conditions. And so in the same section of facets, we have some definition of conditions. We have the condition of height here, 100 meters. We have the definition of this condition, which has quantity number 2, which is pressure. Sorry, is that right? No, this should be, let me look at this. Wind direction, I think it is. So maybe I've got this slightly wrong, but anyway, you get the point. And then the pressure is down here. Yeah, I've got my quantities off. This should be quantity 2. But anyway, I think you get the idea that you can represent the quantities separately than the individual conditions. And so if you had multiple of these data points in the same file, you would only need to represent these quantities once in here to be able to, obviously use them across all of the data points. And then finally, the data points would go into the data set section. And one of the things I typically do is if there's more than one data point, I create a data group. A data group is simply a group of data points that has some kind of commonality to it, whatever that means. So in this case, it's based off of the same ID of location and then the lat long. And then what we do is we can add a reference back to these conditions, or the conditions or the location. So the location is represented here. It's represented here as being related to this particular data point. And then the conditions 2, 5, and 8 that you see right here are also related to this data point. So we've linked the condition information to the individual data points. And then finally, we have the wind speed and the wind direction values here represented. I was looking around to see if I could find ontologies that represented the concept of, or the quantity of wind speed, and I couldn't find it yet. That's one of the things that is obviously important to do this stuff. We're representing units, both of strings, and then there is actually a way online, ontologically, you can represent a unit of measurement as well. So this is from the QUDT website, quantities, units, data, dimensions, and data types. So this is how we set things up. And to be able to do that, in addition to having the SciData ontology for the structure, and that includes the data point and data group definitions and quantities and quantity kinds here, we also have to define in the file a context file for the data specific items. And so what I did here was for the bit that's to do with the fake NOAA data of the lat long and the idea of the location or the wind turbine at which it's being collected. This is what's called a context file. So literally you are identifying the meaning here with what the name of the individual field is. And so we have a few fields that I named here because of being able to represent the location and the actual turbine ID as it was, or the site ID. So that's the basic premise of how you set all this up. When you take this file and you convert it into RDF, which you can do online at a location called the JSON-LD playground, this is kind of what you get. And yes, I know it looks all kind of nasty and difficult to read. And of course, you're not meant to read it. This is meant to go into a graph database so you can search it with a SPARQL query. The basic idea, though, here is that there are many things that are defined within the context of the SciData ontology, which is actually right here. So number, numeric data type, quantity, quantity kind, significant figures, unit of measure, and so on. So there's a lot of built-in data-related definitions, as you might expect. But this isn't all of the triples that comes out of that file. I think there's about 165 that comes out of the file. So this is just a snapshot to show you what this looks like. One final slide, and I think I'm probably out of time for my presentation. I mentioned that I've become interested in wind data recently, and that's because I put in a proposal to this National Science Foundation solicitation, which came out in about April of this year and was due June 20th. And it's building the prototype open knowledge network. And the idea behind this call for proposals is to actually put up data sets from different domains such that they can be reused in the context of an open knowledge network. And I happened to do a presentation on SciData to Sagi Ziesman at NREL, and he followed up a couple of weeks later and said, hey, we think we really want to put a proposal into this particular NSF program. I had already been thinking about it anyway and said, yes, let's get together and do that. So even though I didn't know much at that time about wind data specifically, I was very interested in us putting together a proposal. And so that's what we did, an open knowledge network for renewable energy, specifically renewable offshore wind energy. And so this will take some wind energy data sets, convert them to SciData, put them up in nominally Docker containers with the idea of making those downloadable for anybody to be able to either use locally or obviously put them up in some place where they could be accessed by the community. But also we've basically gone down the path of suggesting we're going to incorporate additional data that will allow us to go down kind of the chain of what's needed in the US to be able to go forward with the 30 gigawatt offshore wind energy challenge that's out there by 2030. Now, I don't know if that's even really doable by that date, but we're going to try and set it up in a way, if we get funded, to put the data out and see if we can semantically represent the data and data along that chain to be able to make predictions, better predictions about where to put wind turbines and how many would be needed to be able to meet this goal of 30 gigawatts. So I'm obviously not the expert on wind, but I obviously thought I should put this in the presentation. Like I said, I have other slides that I can talk about, but in the instance of time, I will stop right now, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Maybe before we get to some technical questions, I just want to get this in. So I'm currently sitting in NREL. I'm doing a research visit, but I'm actually about to leave. But I'm writing a proposal for a joint NSF SNF project, which is a Swiss project. A Swiss call is a call out, which the deadline in October, on the 1st of October. And we are looking at building digital twins, but we're also wanting to do it in order to make decisions, and we want to therefore use these type of concepts and also then publish open data afterwards. I think we need to talk about this separately together, you and me.
Do you know Sagi? Do you know him too or not?
No, and it'd be really good if you could put me in contact with him. I might do from. It's
you
funny.
You might do actually. Maybe I'm saying his name wrong.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm as Yuri said, I lead this IEA Task 43, which is all about data share, well, about digitalization, but quite specifically data sharing. And it's a bit strange that I haven't come in touch with him about that. But NREL can't take part in the call actually, but you probably can. And so let's just take this conversation. I've got 2 weeks holiday, but then I'll be back in August. If we can catch up and have a talk about at least how we can combine what we're planning with what you've submitted here as a very least, and if even
I'd be happy to send you a copy of the proposal.
Yeah, that would be really great. Are you around in August?
I'm around, but it is a very busy time. I have a conference the 3rd week in August. I start classes the 4th week in August, and at the same time as that 4th week, I have an international meeting for IUPAC, the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry, which I will be remotely attending as well. So it's pretty busy, but maybe the 2nd week in August might be good.
We'll try. I'll try. Yeah. I'll make a suggestion, and if reject it or make a different suggestion.
Okay.
We should stop the
just so
recording.
you know, NSF has been very aggressive with this. They will